I love that. And I love the way you characterize, too, the woman's presence at the well as a form of hiding. She's hiding. She knows no one else is going to be there. And that reminds me of the way that Thomas Merton talks about the aim of contemplation leading to unself-consciousness, which correlates, of course, with St. John of the Cross in that final passage of self-abandonment, forgetting myself, all my care is forgotten among the lilies. And contrasting that unself-consciousness, that self-forgetting, with the self-consciousness that Adam and Eve acquire after eating the fruit, because they don't know how to stand naked before God in a joyful way. They're either ashamed, so they hide, or they're covetous and they want to possess God. But just to be vulnerable and naked before God is quite a challenge. Just coming in here today, I felt all of that self-consciousness crud, coming up and burbling up, and oh my gosh, is it going to be okay? Am I going to have food stuck in my teeth? And it's that self-consciousness that is the snare and the trap and the fear that leads us into all of that grandstanding that the Wizard of Oz shows. Pay no attention. So what a beautiful story that is, where Jesus sees through all of it and says, I love you anyway. And being okay with that is really the aim of contemplative living, to rest comfortably with God.
I think one of the gifts, that's being restored is, again, when I was first trained and studied, I approached Scripture almost as a scientist and formed critical historical method and taking it all apart. And yes, it brought it at a distance, but yet it didn't have the impact. It's like to take the story of the prodigal son, another, this wonderful parable. Do I divide it all up and take it, or can I contemplate it and allow the story to become my story? And therefore, when I realize, I am the prodigal son. I am the elder brother, and to allow and to meditate on that. And I have found, especially that story, then when I need to offer a confession, is to be able to quote that prodigal son, I have sinned against God and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be your son. And to use that phrase as in my own confession, or even when I'm in corporate worship and in the moment of silence, to be able to use those phrases and to let that image just waft over me. But what I learned is I was using that image too much. And it was great for the confession time, but I was never hearing the assurance. And so to add, when that that forgiveness is offered, to visualize, not think intellectually, but visualize this loving Father running, and throwing arms around me and welcome me home, to in that contemplative thinking of that and experiencing that, feeling that forgiveness waft over me. In other words, to allow the Scripture, to come alive and be a part of me, and not something objective there that I'm studying. And in the same way, picking up that tradition, I have a lectionary group each week. The group of us get together and we read the passages, and then we don't start talking about it. We have this long moment of silence, before we start. We read them again, and then have silence, and then start, a discussion. A totally different way than just approaching it in the intellectual. And that's, I think, reaching back and allowing that to come a part of our traditions again.
And I think what John just said in talking about Merton too, the thing that always strikes me is that, and going way back in our discussion in terms of time for contemplation, that what our ministry has to be, whether it's formal ministry or just, interaction with other people, is we get the character of that from the scripture. How am I supposed to be? But that besides that, our ministry flows from our spiritual life. The ministry flows from a contemplation. I think, Merton, although he happened to be in the woods, sort of, he was isolated, but he knew everything that was going on in the world, had something to say about everything that was going on in the world. And I think that he was able to be that and do that because it flowed from his prayer, his union with God, with making God's life from Scripture part of his life. So we don't really lose any time. We just enrich the time that we have when we're in our ministry and in sharing with other people.
I was just going to say, I like your example, Joe, of earlier of the use of technology and how we might make use of our avatars on Facebook as a way of connecting with what's going on, sort of a way of discernment. What I like about that is that it integrates the contemplative tradition into the contemporary world. So I for one, do not want to use the contemplative tradition as a kind of sleep, where I set aside a part of my day to go to sleep, because I need to sleep and I need contemplation. What I very much would like is a way of being in the world in which we are living contemplatively, we are working contemplatively, we are playing contemplatively, we are Facebooking contemplatively, so that we have a kind of awareness of ourselves and an ability or a capacity to discern from our actions, from our being in the world, and from our relationships what's really going on in the deep resources or deep recesses of our soul. And for me, the real world, being in the real world, is the canvas of my spirituality. It's the canvas of my soul. It's the way in which I begin, the way in which I project my soul onto the world. And so paying attention to my being in the world seems to be quite critical in my desire to live in a contemplative tradition. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that idea of that's a great example of sort of watching how you want to project a certain way of being on Facebook, because it really does help illuminate a lot of stuff that's going on or could be going on.
Yeah, so I like, that's why again, Brother David Stendelrast's idea of joining the temples, it's a real challenge. In the unenlightened mind, according to Dzogchen or the Buddhist tradition, they talk about Rigpa as this dichotomous mind, the mind that always splits everything into two as separate realities, oppositional realities. It's the mind Adam and Eve acquired when they gained knowledge of good and evil. So the fallen mind is the dichotomous mind that splits everything up. The division between historical critical method versus reading the scriptures in a contemplative way. I'm tying this back into the question of what gems do we want to pull forward. I think the contemplative Christian tradition of reading Scripture according to these four senses of Scripture. What is the literal sense of Scripture? What is the allegorical sense? Or anagogical sense? What's the moral sense? What's the mystical sense? And this is not opposed to historical critical methods, but historical critical methods help us to understand the literal sense. What's the context? To whom are they speaking? What was the mind of author? But if you stop there, it is a dead letter. It's just, it's just a book. But if you move with the tradition into the deeper realms of Scripture, then we close that gap between fantasy and reality. Like Don Quixote, we become the story. We become the story and we live it, and it's real. And this closing of the gap, the joining of the temples, is the challenge. And when it happens, you have that beautiful consolation. You experience the grace of consolation.
Just to elaborate on this a little bit more, on the way over I was listening to Morning Edition, and there's a story about the teachers in Acapulco. Did any of you hear about this? Who are on strike. And they're on strike because they are in fear of their lives. And there's sort of like an incredible amount of gang activity and warfare that's going on in this once beautiful, luscious vacation spot. And I felt a part of me sort of getting really angry with people who could do, I mean, the kinds of things that are going on are just sort of hard to sort of put into words down there. And I found myself getting really angry about that, and just sort of an instant of really wanting to sort of do something very violent to the people that are doing this work, these activities. I have a similar kind of reaction to what's going on in Congress. And the point that I'm trying to make is that I think every moment of our lives we are confronted with sort of multiple, I mean, at least two demands. There's the demand to deal with reality. The fact that teachers are in fear of their lives, that people are getting killed, and that our Congress is sort of grinding our country to a halt economically and culturally and whatever, those are realities that we are not being asked to, but we are being demanded to address. We have to deal with that. And so we have to pay attention to that. Well, at the same time, we also have to pay attention to our inner self. And it's that reaction of the inner self. It's the anger that welled up within me about hearing the story of the teachers in Acapulco, the anger that wells up within me whenever I hear stories about what's going on or not going on in Congress. That says a lot about who I am, where I am in my own journey. And that material becomes the work of my spiritual journey, I think. So that's what I meant when I said integrating, that we're looking to the world. We have to act in the world, and we have to meet the demands of the everyday life that we are pursuing. But at the same time, that life and those demands also offer us the opportunity to live more deeply in relationship to ourselves, with our world, with our God, with nature, with one another.